Spirit Airlines filed for bankruptcy, and the story of how the cheapest way to fly collapsed is stranger and more instructive than any headline suggests. On the morning of March 18, 2008, a senior airline analyst published a note about a carrier that had, by every standard metric, done everything right. The company had grown from 3 planes serving a single route to more than 100 aircraft blanketing the Caribbean and the eastern seaboard. It had posted 19 consecutive profitable quarters, a streak the legacy carriers could only envy. Its culture had been studied at Harvard Business School. The analyst's note opened with a single directive: sell. The stock that day sat at $4.99. It had lost nearly 70% of its value in less than 2 years. Not because of a crash. Not because of a strike, an oil shock, or a terrorist attack. Because of a structural truth the company's model had hidden in plain sight, one the executives inside the Florida headquarters could not bring themselves to name. The company was Spirit Airlines. Did the people running Spirit actually know what was coming, or were they genuinely blind to it? You have almost certainly seen the headlines from November 2024. Spirit filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, its fleet grounded, its stock delisted, its name entering the permanent record of American business collapses. You may have watched a video about the $23 carry-on bag fee and nodded along with the chorus of people insisting the carrier got what it deserved. That version of the story is tidy. It is also incomplete by roughly half. The fall of Spirit Airlines is not a story about a joke that went too far. It is the story of a business model that discovered, at the worst possible moment, that its entire architecture rested on an assumption no one had ever stress-tested. The assumption had been false from the start. What exactly was that assumption, and how did it survive long enough to bring down an entire airline? The airline did not fail because it charged too little or too much. It failed because the thing that made it invincible through deregulation, recessions, and the post-9/11 winter was not a moat. It was a bet. In the spring of 2024, that bet was finally called. What does it actually take to look at an entire industry and see the one fact that everyone else has agreed to ignore? Spirit's origin is older and stranger than the airline itself. The company began in 1964 as Clipper Trucking Company, hauling freight through Michigan. Not an airline. Not a travel brand. A trucking outfit. Ned Homfeld bought it in 1974, renamed it Ground Air Transfer, layered on a travel club, and by 1980 was running charter flights to Atlantic City and Las Vegas under the name Charter One. The first scheduled passenger flight carrying the Spirit name did not depart until 1992. Nearly 3 decades of reinvention before the airline most people recognize ever existed. That reinvention did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because the entire legal architecture of American aviation was being torn down and rebuilt from scratch. The single most consequential regulatory event in the history of American commercial flight was not a crash, not a merger, not a war. It was a document, typed, photocopied, and circulated through the offices of the Civil Aeronautics Board in the mid-1970s. That paper carried a proposal most of Washington considered political suicide: strip the federal government of the power to set airline prices, routes, and schedules. Let the market decide who flies where and for how much. Most of the industry read that proposal and lobbied against it. Established carriers had spent decades operating inside a regulated system that guaranteed them routes and protected them from price wars. Deregulation meant exposure. It meant competition from carriers willing to operate in ways the legacy airlines never had to consider. That exposure was exactly the opening Spirit's model was built to exploit. A carrier with no legacy costs, no union contracts negotiated under the old regime, and no expectation of government-protected margins could do something the majors structurally could not: price a seat at a number that looked like a mistake and still turn a profit on the back end. Here is the number that makes that model concrete: Spirit, at its peak, derived more revenue from fees than from the base fare itself. The ticket was almost beside the point. The question worth sitting with is this. If the structural logic of that model was this visible, this traceable back to a single regulatory break, did the people steering Spirit in its final years actually see where the cracks were forming? Or did they believe the bet would hold forever? Here is what they actually believed, and why that belief, for a long time, looked completely correct. The investors in that Fort Lauderdale conference room were not irrational. The math Shore and Baldanza put on the table was real. Strip the airplane, sell every seat at $79, charge separately for the bag and the soda and the seat assignment, and your cost per available seat mile drops below anything a legacy carrier can touch. The unit economics do not just tilt in your favor. They invert entirely, so Baldanza joined in. The pitch worked. And the model worked spectacularly for years. Spirit's bet was not simply that cheap fares attract passengers. That part was obvious. The deeper assumption, the structural one, was that ultra-low base fares would remain the only viable path to genuinely affordable air travel. Legacy carriers, tangled in union contracts and wide cabins and hub complexity, could not descend to Spirit's cost floor. That gap, the gap between what a legacy paid to move a seat and what Spirit paid, was Spirit's entire business. As long as that gap held, the model held. For roughly a decade, it did. And here is the perspective worth forcing on yourself. Spirit's passengers were not Spirit's customers in the traditional sense. They were, functionally, the raw material the fee architecture processed. The base fare got them to the gate. Everything after the base fare was where Spirit actually made its money. The passenger who showed up at the airport with an oversized carry-on was not an inconvenience. They were a revenue event. The model was not built around flying people. It was built around the behavioral gap between what a passenger assumed they'd pay and what they actually paid. That is a brilliant architecture, until the assumptions beneath it erode. The core assumption was falsified, not by a single catastrophe, but by a slow structural shift. Low-cost competitors began closing the cost floor gap. Larger carriers, stung by years of margin pressure, began studying Spirit's own fee playbook and grafting pieces of it onto their existing networks. The things Spirit had counted on, exclusive access to the ultra-low-cost floor, became a contested space rather than proprietary ground. The gap narrowed. The inversion that had made the model genius began to flatten. Spirit had not made a bad bet in 1999. It had made a bet with an expiration date it did not see coming, and spent its best years building an infrastructure optimized for a gap that was quietly closing around it. What happens when a fortress built on talent quietly empties out?
In 2006, Baldanza became CEO. Spirit's stock price was $9.
Within 6 years, it would trade above $24, and the carrier would be the most profitable airline in North America by operating margin. That was the peak, and peaks, by definition, have only one direction left. Spirit did not invent the ultra-low-cost model. It perfected it. For roughly 18 years, that perfection looked like a permanent structural advantage. The airline survived 9/11. It grew through periods when legacy carriers were filing for bankruptcy and retrenching their networks. And because it survived and grew, the talent it cultivated became the most sought after in the industry. Route planners who could wring profit from a secondary airport in Plattsburgh. Revenue managers who built the algorithm that priced a carry-on bag higher than the seat beneath it. They did not stay. Ben Baldanza stepped down as CEO in January 2016. The board replaced him with Bob Fornaro, former CEO of AirTran. Within 18 months, Baldanza had joined the board of JetBlue. Ted Bodemer, the senior vice president of network planning who had designed Spirit's point-to-point map, left to consult for multiple carriers. The executives who had built the machine that printed 30% operating margins were now advising the very companies Spirit had spent a decade undercutting. The diaspora spread across the American airline industry. And the problem with a diaspora is that the architecture walks out the door with the architects. The model itself was not broken. It was complete. There was no second act waiting on the other side of near 30% margins. The talent exodus was not a symptom of failure. It was a consequence of success. The passengers who had once had no other choice eventually got one. Budget competitors multiplied. Legacy carriers launched their own bare-bones fares. The structural moat Spirit had spent 2 decades digging slowly filled in. Spirit Airlines went bankrupt not because the model failed. It went bankrupt because the model worked, until the world it was built for stopped existing. And the problem with a diaspora is that the architecture walks out the door with the architects. The model itself was not broken. It was complete. There was no second act waiting on the other side of near 30% margins. The talent exodus was not a symptom of failure. It was a consequence of success. The passengers who had once had no other choice eventually got one. Budget competitors multiplied. Legacy carriers launched their own bare-bones fares. The structural moat Spirit had spent 2 decades digging slowly filled in. Spirit Airlines went bankrupt not because the model failed. It went bankrupt because the model worked, until the world it was built for stopped existing.